All right. Okay, everybody. So let's get started. We're running a little bit late. It's my privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Barbara Harris-White, who is Professor Emeritus at Oxford University. She's the author of dozens of books and hundreds of journal articles. I'm not even going to try and sum up her work. I can't even really get you a sense of the scope and breadth of her work on development. What I would like to do, however, is just briefly talk about what I find most compelling about her approach. So, in Professor White's work, when you talk about development and the associated processes, you see them not as operating over and above the heads of people. You see people at various strata of society as willful agents in that process. And that, I think, is a very useful way of merging macro, top-down, long-term studies with a micro-level, grassroots, bottoms-up kind of approach. So again, I have learned very much from Professor White's interrogation of development, especially from the vantage point of the informal sector. And I believe today's talk also does more of the same. So she's going to talk about the agrarian crisis in India, and in a way where the crisis is man-made, and therefore it can be dismantled or undone by humans as well. So I'm not going to take up more time. It's a pleasure to have Professor White with us, and I would like her to now speak to us about her work on the agrarian crisis in India, and draw some parallels, if possible, with the situation in Pakistan. Okay, Professor White, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Azhar. I am very grateful to you for chairing this, and to Leila Farouk, and to IBA Karachi for having invited me. I apologize for not being with you in person, but I couldn't have made it under any circumstances. And it's due to the miracle of Zoom that we can communicate, and I hope we communicate productively. Yes, I want to talk about India, but I also want to talk about Pakistan. And may I share my screen? I do want to talk about agriculture and what's happening to it in South Asia. But as Dr. Azhar explained, I generally work on India, and I feel much more confident talking about India, even from Oxford, than I do talking about Pakistan. However, this map shows that there's an enormous amount of overlap between the constituent countries of South Asia. And what it would please me to do is that an audience in Pakistan listens to what I have to say about India and asks the same questions of Pakistan. And I hope that we might have a fruitful conversation about the possibilities of comparison despite this frontier after my talk. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about India, and then I'm going to talk about Pakistan. And I'm going to say that in both cases, the problems of agriculture are a concatenation crisis. They're a concatenation event. They're the coming together of many different kinds of processes which are unfolding in the same space over the same time. And for India, I've divided them between long-term, medium-term, and short-term. And the paradox there is that it seems that the long-term context of this crisis is market-mediated, whereas the short-term context of the crisis may well be state-mediated. Anyway, in the long term, we have over half a century of warnings, even from Emma Swaminathan in 1968, about the adverse effects of the seed fertilizer revolution. And so in India, there are really serious problems of soil degradation, of water scarcity, of biodiversity decline. And this is an enormous problem, which it would take another lecture, and I'm not really going to talk about it, but it forms the background of what I want to say. Then one has not structural change as you have in Pakistan, but the miniaturization of holdings, which has been happening over the entire last century. increasing the density of the population on the land by about a factor of 4, and increasing landlessness, complete propertylessness of the rural population, but still accommodating an enormous population, millions upon millions of people, 86% who have under 2 hectares of land. So miniaturization. And then these holdings, even 100 years ago, the Royal Commission on Agriculture, which included what is now Pakistan, was declaring very confidently that most of these holdings were unviable. So we have to ask ourselves, over 100 years, how have these miniaturized holdings survived? And the answer is they cannot survive without remittances, self-employment, wage work of various sorts, and livestock, which is hugely important for the people at the bottom of the pile. In the 21st century, turning to the medium term, agriculture has become more and more invisible in terms of GDP, in terms of public expenditure, and it's now regarded as a welfare sector. And yet it was very important during the COVID epidemic and created more than 8 times more jobs than in manufacturing and construction during the last 2 years. It has been beset, like Pakistan, by volatile prices. The moment you open yourself to world market prices, you have this problem. And there is a cost price squeeze, which is most punitive for the class at the bottom of the pile, the petty producers, but it also affects the larger producers, the people who are in command of the marketed surplus. Growth rates in agriculture are declining, and there is a complete explosion of rural debt. The short-term constitutive context, which I'm going to place post-2014 with Mr. Modi's and the BJP's coming to power, is a series of thunderclap policies which have had terrible impacts on the rural economy. Again, I can't go into it very much, but demonetization, in which farmers didn't have cash to pay labor, to buy inputs, to sell products, trust-based credit dried up, and farmers were not knowledgeable enough about digital technology to make use of it. That was one thunderclap policy affecting agriculture. Sales tax has been another one. The labor laws and the COVID response have been a third big challenge to agriculture. And in 2016, the government declared that it would double farm incomes by 2022. And then we had the farm laws, which is the trigger for putting this lecture together. So a lot of shocks to agriculture. So whereas the farmers identify the crisis in returns to production, the cost price squeeze, and the volatility and the decline in farm incomes as the major factor in the crisis, I see it as 5 interrelated elements. And in the rest of this part of my talk, before I turn to Pakistan, what I would like to do is go through the 5 elements in the crisis. Is that okay?
Please do that. Yeah.
And these are wages, returns to production, farm incomes, markets and mandis, and the new scale of corporate capital. And although I don't know as much about Pakistan, I think that these factors also have a role to play in your country as well. So let us first turn to wages. What's wrong with them? Well, the historic role of Indian agriculture hasn't really been to finance the development of the rest of the economy. It's really been to absorb an enormous population of labor. 70% of the entire labor force was in agriculture at independence, and it's still over 55% now. At independence, about a third of the rural households were landless, and it's now 55. It's over half the rural households are landless now. Mechanization of agriculture is both an opportunity for labor. Irrigation increases demand, so do tractors, because they enable more seasons of cultivation. But it's also a threat to livelihoods. in harvest, with threshers, with post-harvest technology, about which very little is written, but millions and millions of jobs have been lost in that part of the system. Agricultural wages are regionally very uneven. Kerala tops the lot, where they're over 700 rupees a day. And by the way, an Indian rupee, well, let me put it another way. Pakistan rupee is 0.42 Indian rupees. I found out this morning. So a wage of 700 a day is over 3 times more than it is at the same time in Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, and Gujarat. So we don't have a national market for labor, and there isn't a wage rate that you can confidently say represents Indian labor. It varies enormously. Of course, labor costs vary with crops, but they tend to be between 20 and 50% of the costs of production. And of course, agricultural employers must keep this cost as low as they can. And Government of India economists in Niti Aayog nail agricultural labor as the cost which is dangerously rising in the 21st century, where real wages have tracked labor productivity in agriculture. And they write about cost-driven inflation affecting the entire economy. And of course, they're right, because labor costs and the price of labor will affect all the other prices in the agricultural economy and the non-farm economy. So there's a politics of keeping agricultural labor wages as low as possible in order to retain the rates of return in agriculture. And the Indian government is now lauding a new wave of mechanization, which will actually threaten that labor and displace it. Did labor play a part in the agrarian protests last year, the biggest protest in the history of the world? I think not really, although there are apologists for labor. Labor is divided, ruled, marginalized, except that, let us not forget, while the farmers were protesting in India, the laborers were cultivating the crops. So they were working throughout the agrarian protests, and perhaps that's how they contributed to it. They made it possible because they went on producing. Okay, returns to production. Averages are not great, and that is really because farm sizes are so low. Let me go back. And the growth that has taken place over the last few years, if we discount for inflation, the growth may well be negative for all but the top elite of agricultural producers. And the input-output terms of trade, that is the long-term relations between prices for inputs and prices for outputs, are increasingly adverse. Input prices are rising, output prices are rising less quickly, and they're also much more volatile. And as I said before, we have a miniaturized agrarian structure. 86% of farm households have under 2 hectares or 5 acres of agriculture, and they supply at most 1/3 of the income, with the rest coming from wage work, self-employment, with or without migration, and the much neglected livestock economy. I don't know whether livestock is neglected in Pakistan, but it's completely under the radar in India. It's not even part of agricultural statistics. It is part of agriculture plus allied activities. But without livestock, you wouldn't have agriculture at all. So we have a disproportionate increase in costs not matched by increase in output or prices and an explosion of debt. That is a real crisis, especially for small farmers. Mr. Modi promised to double farm incomes between 2016 and 2022, that's now, and the promise is definitely broken. And what have they done? They have extended the 5-year promise to 6 years. They've moved the goalposts. They've even aspired to bring farm incomes to parity with those working in non-agriculture, which is moonshine. They rely in Niti Aayog on technology, but not systematic, a kind of invoking of technologies of one kind or another, solar, bee production, milk production. This is not a systematic project to double farm incomes. And the stakes are very high and the statistics are non-existent. We don't actually know what's happened to farm incomes, although the latest NSS sample round suggests it's nowhere near doubled. And as I said, may even be negative during that period. And the Electricity Amendment Bill, which you may not have heard of, which was one of the goals of the farm protest, it seeks to centralize the privatization and the management of electricity subsidies, and that is absolutely vital for irrigation, which is, like Labour, a further threat to the costs of production. So we don't see any action by the state, which is a realistic response to that promise to increase farm incomes, hence a crisis. And next I turn to markets, which I've been studying for 50 years. 3/4 of the production is marketed, and most of that is marketed in villages, and most of that is marketed to private traders and moneylenders, who have been demonized ever since records began as using multiple modes of exploitation in their apparently simple exchange, the first transaction between the producer and the trader. There's a big literature showing that in India, exchange relations are class-specific and commodity-specific, depending on the size of the consignment, the need of the seller, the risk, the perishability of the good concerned. And there's a big literature on interlocked contracts, which have been concluded to be class exploitive. They exploit in locking contracts between, say, money for inputs or for payment of labor and for the product after the harvest. It's particularly punitive for small producers and who are charged higher interest rates and lower prices as a result, so that their rate of return is quite different from the rate of return of large farmers who are able to speculate before they engage with the market. And this literature also shows that the traders have a non-economic relationship as well as an economic relationship with producers. They provide a range of services, they give them contacts, they give credit for emergencies, and they may well be political patrons as well. So for a very long time, the capacity of the marketing system to absorb a vast number of intermediaries, and we might call them livelihoods, has been criticized as extreme intermediation and as extraordinarily inefficient. And this class of traders are long-time supporters of the current government. So you wonder why they have a crisis, although they do support all political parties in a kind of Vickers of Bray set of financial donations to hedge their risks. And they are castigated as inefficient, but the counter-argument is that what they do is bulk. They bulk up tiny marketed surpluses and make it and turn it into large-scale consignments for larger-scale capital in the rest of the marketing system. At any rate, there's quite a lot of consensus that the first transaction between the farmer and the trader is still one that's very problematic. Now, we academics and the state classify traders through the stages of the marketing system. And we kind of imagine it as a ladder, a value chain or a supply chain. But if you actually ask traders what they do, what you find is that they tend to do unique, complex permutations of activities, which gives the whole system a resilience to shocks to it, some of which are political, but some of which are weather related. And those traders may be classified under the labels of stages, but actually what they do is an empirical question. We don't know enough about it, but they tend to be unique. So the marketing system is more like a sponge rather than a ladder. And many of the traders are farmers. Many of them build portfolios by vertically integrating activities or by diversifying out of agro-commerce and out of agriculture into services and industry. They may be agents of big corporations, which reduces their risk. And that class is also entering the bureaucracy, which cements a lot of links they have with the state. It's not the state versus the market when individual brothers within a family are working in both. Throughout India, what we find, and I don't know whether this is true of Pakistan, that we find that there are local mercantile oligopolies. There's just a handful of merchants in each commodity in every place, which dominate the trade flows in a marketplace. And they tend to coexist with vast numbers of small traders. And just as agricultural markets are not static, one kind of trader is accumulating, another kind of trader is expanding by multiplying small units. And the whole system of markets is proliferating with endless commodification of products and byproducts. Now, why is this in crisis? Well, I'm not sure it is any more in crisis than it used to be. There are 7,000 regulated market sites. They are regulated with rules which were first introduced to what is now India plus Pakistan plus Bangladesh in the 1930s and implemented in India in force in the 1960s to improve first transactions. But these agricultural product market committees legislation has been very patchily implemented and it's inadequate. On the average, each regulated market serves about 6 times the size of area as is recommended. And because it's small and areas are very large, it's easy to avoid this legislation and conduct the first transaction in an unregulated manner, which disadvantages the farmer. Many of these marketplaces are still growing weeds. Often they're used by non-local traders who come in to buy and export out of the locality. They're very frequently penetrated by untransparent customary practices, or they're cartelized in a collusive manner. And there are cases that I know of, not a million miles away from Karachi, where they're being used as laundromats for black political money. Now, some states have already deregulated this legislation, but it hasn't really improved the first transaction for farmers, nor has it made the marketing system more competitive. So quite a few states have started to free up those restrictions. It did not need the central government to do that, with varying degrees of success. Anyway, what I think it's important to realize is there's a huge critical literature about these markets and their need for reform. But despite or because of them, India has long had a national agricultural market. Even if it's not perfect, it's segmented, it's imperfectly integrated, but it has existed for a very, very long time. And it's certainly not a product of the Green Revolution, nor is it a product of the 21st century. I just want to distinguish what I've said from the states that border Pakistan, because in the northwest, in Haryana and Punjab and the western parts of UP and Madhya Pradesh, grain as a cash crop is purchased in these markets at a set price called the minimum support price by a state corporation and not by private traders. A state corporation is called the Food Corporation, and the private traders act as commission agents and they act as bankers for the Food Corporation and money lenders to the producers. So they're in a kind of low risk intermediary position. And while this arrangement is strategically important for India's food security, and while the minimum support price is also strategically important for producers, this arrangement that I'm just describing is unusual and it doesn't extend to the rest of India. And it's based on completely the opposite principle for that of the regulated markets, the agricultural product market committees, in which markets are basically okay and all you need is a light touch regulation of the farmer's first transaction with the trader. Instead, the public distribution system is based on the opposite principle, that the marketing systems are so inefficient that they need direct public control for social objectives like food security, especially for the poor, distributional projects, and buffers for periodic droughts or external shocks like the war in Ukraine right now. And while the FCI dominates, every single Indian state can, and most of them do, establish civil supplies, storage corporation, co-ops, and so on and so forth. And again, there's a literature which describes the creaky and flawed administration of all these state institutions, delayed payments, losses, fraud. But the alternative is, as Amartya Sen once said, a distribution of income where market exchange is consistent with people with no income at all. So the alternative is unthinkable in India. And despite neoliberal reforms, the public distribution system is a very, very important plank of India's threatened democracy. Anyway, what I want you to take away is that the main markets develop in a permanent tension of selective implementation and opposite regulative principles. And the Indian state is riven with these tensions. And if you look at regulative law, you'll find it sort of sediments itself almost like geological sediments, policies, institutions over time. And I think the reasoned conclusion from this, I hope I haven't bored you with too much detail, is that India certainly needs better regulation and not deregulation. But deregulation is what it's getting. The last part of the crisis is competition with the system I've just described from a new, and I'm going to put that in scare quotes, a new scale of corporate capital. I think my theme is that it's not so new. The critical explanation given by scholars is that the crisis of low returns and non-performing assets in the corporate economy drives corporate capital to seek low and assured investments in the agricultural sector. But it's not so simple. Corporate capital can't take over land. It's confined to inputs and products. And so commodities like basmati rice, which is important to Pakistan, is also important for this sector, very much larger scale capital in India. And there's a long history of corporate activity and of state support for corporate activity. And in tiny font, I'm giving you the detail, which I'll just run through, of the Adani group, because they illustrate what's going on and what other corporate agribusiness is doing in India. They started to build grain stores in 2000, and they were commissioned by the government of India to do that. And then in the early noughties, between 2003 and 2007, they were commissioned by the Food Corporation to build silos in Northwest India. And that silo building project extended to 10 agribusiness companies and 6 Indian states. And just remember, we're talking about Congress rule. We're talking about the early part of the 21st century. After that, Adani set out on a spree of building agri-infrastructure and transport infrastructure, processing infrastructure, ports, stores, and so on and so forth, in a project of sort of port to plate infrastructure. And that really took him the next 10 years, after which he started to trade, and he's exporting rice, wheat, and pulses to China. And the point I want to make to you is that this is nothing to do with the BJP. This has been happening under 3 different governments, Indian governments. So it's medium to long term. It's not just it's more and more large companies, and it's basically the infrastructure for agriculture rather than seizing land and cultivating directly. But this scale of capital faces the 75% with under 1 hectare, with a huge step change in the already massive power asymmetry. And it's a completely inscrutable pricing environment, so that farmers will be faced with less choice under a justification which says more choice. And it is a combination of these crises that has fomented the farm protest. Now, why does the government do this? Why does it not keep encouraging the intermediate classes, the local traders and moneylenders? The new scale is encouraged to keep the structure of informal prices in the whole of the rest of the economy intact, and to keep pressing labor and continue to shift the distributive shares, the relationship between wages and profits, toward profits and away from wages. Now, this scale of capital also threatens the commercial class, the commission agents, the artiers, the wholesalers, and so on. But they are already busy sabotaging neoliberal policies and implementation. So it's not a threat that actually is felt as emasculating the intermediate classes in agro-commerce. Okay, but last summer, without any democratic consultation, summer 2020, the government of India pushed through 3 laws which triggered the biggest and longest protests in the history of the world. I'm not going to talk much about them. There's a large literature. If anybody wants to explore it, I'm very happy to give the literature, to send it by email. There are 3 laws. One is called the Agreement on Price Assurances and Farm Services, which is exactly the opposite of what it is. It's welcome to corporates under the guise of freeing up choice. One is the the Regulated Market Bypass Act, saying that you can trade any way you like, which has been happening anyway. And an amendment to the Essential Commodities Act, which has been amended about 70 times. But this amendment gives unlimited freedom to traders and processors to store. The acts themselves are poor quality law. Nobody I've asked knows who wrote these laws. And they have been subject to much critique by agricultural economists. But I want to finish my talk on the India side of things to speculate about why the government, having provoked a protest which began in September 2020, capitulated in November 2021 after more than a year of protest, why they actually repealed these bills which they had put into law. Because that, I think, tells us interesting things about India's political economy, and may tell you, may trigger ideas about Pakistan too. Okay. Underneath the radar, over the radar being the farm protests, which received worldwide publicity for their novel organization and their claims and their justifications. There were a lot of interests which were actually supportive of these farm law reforms. First and foremost, the committee which the government of India appointed to listen and to advise, in other words, to be neutral. It produced a report in mid-March. The government of India sat on it for a year, and finally it was released 2 days ago by a farm leader who's also an economist. And this report, which I can't get hold of, but the reports in the Indian press say that the report says that the vast majority of farmers supported the acts, whereas what we can glean from what the committee itself did, the people they consulted, was that they overwhelmingly consulted traders and exporters and processors and millers, the people in my marketing system. And that the report is quite gung-ho about scrapping the Essential Commodities Act, which is the act which frames the public distribution system for cheap food for the poor population of India. So against what some economists find, they claim that the silent majority supported the laws, and they certainly did support the laws, even though they were set up to be neutral. And then we know that right from the outset, some farmers' unions did support and didn't protest. The All India Kisan Coordinating Committee in 10 states supports it. We need to know why. They think that agriculture will be made more competitive. They think the laws will create a level playing field between private trade and the state. They want rich, non-agricultural individuals to buy land. That's the Amitabh Bachchan case, who's forbidden to buy land because he doesn't have any land. But these unions say, let anybody buy land and scrap the PDS, since the public distribution system, since it restricts freedom to export, and so on and so forth. So there are unions which made it publicly clear right at the outset that they were in favor of these farm laws, which threaten so many farmers. The intermediate classes, the agricultural traders, did not object, but they didn't make a lot of noise. But the prospect of being recruited as agents for the corporate agribusiness new scale of capital is enhanced if the state subcontracts the roles of the PDS from corporations to private corporates. And they are already diversifying their portfolios out of agricultural trade. So the stakes are less vitally important than they might have been 20, 30 years ago. Organized industry, looking at the chambers of commerce and the big apex federated industry bodies, were rattled by the fact that the protest blocked their export supply chains and argued quite openly that the farm laws are pro-business. They expect them to attract foreign direct investment in agriculture and in agribusiness. They're for the new scale, of course. They're for the removal of entry barriers to big capital. And they see opportunities for digital tech, agricultural insurance, all kinds of high-tech new market platforms. And behind them, I think we have the global grain oligopoly, the World Trade Organization, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the powerful management consultants who are operating behind the scenes and attacking India's subsidies for livelihoods and for food security. So what I see is that on the one hand, you had a very big, long, well-organized, well-supported farm protest. And then below the radar, you have a completely different project of support for the laws going on. Now, why were they repealed? Well, this slide simply indicates, because time is going to run out, the kinds of interests that caused the BJP and Mr. Modi to repeal farm laws, which was regarded as a humiliation for him by some political commentators. But I think, and these cartoons suggest, that the protests did have weight and put pressure on the BJP, which lost catastrophically in the state of Punjab in the local elections because of its vilification and hostility to the farmers' protest. So the mainstream explanation is that the farm protest was successful. But I think what we have to include in Modi's decision-making are two other factors. One is votes, and the UP Uttar Pradesh election was coming up, and they have got back despite a lot of hostility in UP during the time of the protests. But what I think is more important are the two cartoons in the middle, which is that, as I explained earlier, agribusiness is doing very well without these reformed farm laws. It doesn't need the farm laws to be reformed in order to build its large-scale systems. And it uses existing intermediaries to do the costly, labor-intensive bit of the marketing system, which is bulking small producers' marketed surplus into big consignments. So I think that those factors were actually as important, but it doesn't make me very popular to say that. Okay, summing up for India, I hope what you take away is that the food system, the agricultural system, is permanently embroiled in tensions, that these tensions are not new, there's a long history to them, and that we have concatenation event boiling up over the last 2-3 years. But let's be very suspicious of the silence after the repeal of these laws, and let's imagine that the processes that I've identified in support of them are moving away with under-the-table political lobbying while we speak. So for India, repealing the farm laws and the victory to the protesters really doesn't solve the crisis of neoliberalism in agriculture, the inadequacy of agricultural wages, the agricultural incomes for the vast majority of small farmers, the threats from the step change in agro-capital, the future of administered prices for the public distribution system, or the big problem of agricultural degradation. Okay, so I'm going to stop talking about India now, and may I have a few minutes to talk about Pakistan?
You can take 5 more minutes, then we need to...
Yes, that would be perfect.
Questions.
That would be
okay.
perfect.
All right.
Thank you. Well, I know less about Pakistan. I've supervised 1 or 2 very able Pakistani students. No more. Some of my best students have been from Pakistan over the last 50 years. But I can't pretend I know as much as I know about India. But this journal, Millennial Asia, which I'm putting up in front of you now, the December issue is one about the agricultural crisis in the whole of South Asia, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And I'm very indebted to Hashim bin Rashid for his analysis. Okay. I think that you can argue that Pakistan's agrarian crisis is also a concatenation process, and you can also identify long-term, I'm not so sure about, but medium-term and short-term processes which have erupted in crises in the agricultural sector. The longer-term processes are the decline in state support, which can be dated to the 1980s, a vast reduction in the budget, affecting seeds and fertilizers, extension and credit, and tube wells. And alongside that, a privatization of the post-harvest system and the kinds of liberalization policies that open Pakistan's agricultural markets to international trade, which has resulted in exposing them to international volatility and destabilizing returns to production. There's also a literature in Pakistan which talks about insecure property rights, and what they're referring to are the rental contracts that a lot of farmers still have. There's far more renting in Pakistan than there is in India. And there's also outright theft and contention over land in Pakistan, according to the literature that I've read. It's also widely thought to be underbanked. And of course, India was well banked until the 1990s and is now also underbanked. And Labour is leaving and has left to the non-farm economy. But now there's a crisis because, as I'm going to explain, it has returned. And in the 21st century, the short-term processes that are resulting in big problems for agriculture are that synergy between public and private investment that economists are always talking about is dropping, and that private investment is the growth rates are atrophying, and they're reflected in yield and most seriously in the crops which are most important to Pakistan, such as cotton and sugarcane and wheat and rice. And we can see a triple crisis in agriculture, which Hashim bin Rashid is calling a crisis of reproduction and a crisis of accumulation. And I think they're good ideas to think with. Plus, the ecological crisis, which we mustn't forget, even if I'm not focusing on it now, because it's not going to get better quickly. So let's look at the other two, the reproduction squeeze and the accumulation squeeze. The reproduction squeeze is a phrase invented by Henry Bernstein ages ago, talking about petty production, where the relationship between costs and returns are such that the viability of agriculture is really threatened. So Pakistan agriculture is similar to India's in the sense that it's about 20% of GDP, but 40% of livelihoods. But unlike India, it seems to be much more classically differentiated. And on this slide, I'm talking about the nearly 60% of farms with less than 2 hectares, which control about 16% of the land. And they're having a tough time. They are growing, after the Green Revolution, growing riskier crops, which are more volatile. And because of price volatility, are thought to be reverting to subsistence crops and crops which are best protected by the state itself. And yet, as I said, the state subsidies to agriculture are declining. And you only need a rise in animal pests and diseases and plant pests and diseases, and you get a real crisis. And Pakistan literature is beginning to worry about food scarcity and malnutrition. And these conditions are much exacerbated by the displacement of labor from textiles and from the informal economy back to the villages because of COVID, which is something that also happened in India. As in India, the marketed surpluses of the small farmers are dependent on the intermediation by commission agents. Small farmers don't have storage or bargaining power. And during the COVID years, there's also been a disruption of access to agricultural markets. And so price collapses, which have nothing really to do with scarce production, but scarce market supplies. Pakistan also has something of a crisis of agricultural labor. About half the total workforce is in agriculture. The markets for labor are segmented as they are in India. Unlike India, which has had declining real wages over decades and decades, Pakistan until about 1985 had rises in real wages, real spectacular rises in the wages of agricultural labor. And the distributive share, the relationship between wages and profits, started to shift towards labor. But from then on, it's downhill all the way. And in the 21st century, increases in the supply of people to rural work because of lack of alternative in the non-farm economy has meant that nominal wages have fallen and so have real wages. And the productivity of agricultural labor has also fallen. So there's a crisis in labor in agriculture because there also is a crisis in alternatives to agricultural work in Pakistan. And worst of all, I have to say this, the biggest crisis is in the gender gap in pay. It's the worst of all 13 Asian countries studied by the International Labour Office. Okay, almost finished. If we turn from what's going on, the crises for labour and the crises for the smaller farmers, and look at the elite, why should they be suffering a crisis at all? But they are. In Pakistan, just 2% of farm households control over 20 hectares, but they control nearly half the land together as a class. And they're quite internally differentiated between an old elite, which has now formed an enormous nexus of land, agro-industrial capital, and a nexus with the bureaucracy and with politicians, controlling sugar and wheat, export subsidies, and keeping domestic prices as high as possible, despite the existence of buffer stocks, and widening constantly, as far as we can tell, widening the distributive margin against producers. In other words, this is an agrarian class, which the center of gravity of which is in agribusiness rather than in land, which is quite happy to exploit producers. And then there's a new class of farmers who are beneficiaries of the Green Revolution, who often lease in hundreds, if not thousands of hectares. So they're very big, much bigger than in India. And they are producing riskier and riskier unregulated crops and export crops, which depend on volatile international prices and are increasingly dependent on subsidies, which are declining, and on cheap labor. And this class, like their elite counterparts, are dependent on their post-harvest portfolios, their investments, not in land, for their income, and especially in storage. And the storage is controlled by a larger fraction of capital. Okay, so they're also much richer, but in terms of the security of their business, they are facing all kinds of problems. And I'm almost finished. There are three kinds of reaction to this situation in Pakistan that I can understand. One is the mainstream reaction, Bretton Woods, increased market integration. These problems are happening because markets are not performing in the textbook way. More storage, more agribusiness, so to serve the global agro-industrial agenda. But we know that that kind of set of policies has adverse effects on the agrarian reproduction crisis for the vast majority of human beings who are dependent on agriculture. The second route is the route of agroecology. That's many names for this route. And this is championed by the politics of food nationalism and food sovereignty. And along with agroecology is a call for agriculture for small farmers, putting them central, respect for indigenous knowledge, respect for localized, decentralized market systems. And much as there is science behind this, and it does seem to be a utopian reaction, because this, if generalized, would disrupt strategic supplies to the non-farm economy and to the urban population and all of you. And it's heavily politically contested. And then your PKI, your big union, has suggested resisting in a different way with a different path. So it's sort of selective liberalization. So retaining state involvement for certain things like seeds, electricity, fertilizer, some inputs, protecting some output prices, but allowing others to export if domestic prices are low, so that they reap higher returns from export. And yes, to reforms which improve the first transaction, which is this argument that's been going on in South Asia for over a century. But these reforms have differentiated outcomes for farmers. So the PKI is a very dodgy, is a creaking coalition, because what it's advocating satisfies some of its constituents, but not others. And in any case, Pakistan's developmental state has been captured by this big nexus of politicians, bureaucrats, and agro-industrial capital. Okay, last slide. Trying to think of how we might think of comparisons between India and Pakistan. I'm thinking of comparisons despite the contrast in agrarian structures. How about the idea that there are concatenation processes going on in both countries? We mustn't just pigeonhole agriculture and think of agriculture in a narrow way. We have to put agriculture in its systems and also embed it in its histories. And then it doesn't seem to me, and I may be wrong and I'll stand corrected, but there don't seem to be signs of resolution either in India or in Pakistan to the crisis of wages, to the crisis of farm incomes, what Rashid calls the reproduction crisis for the mass of small producers, for the new problems of domination by corporate agribusiness, for the withering of state budgets, both for regulation and for support. There's a huge new literature on repurposing subsidies, which is called repurposing support, but it's really state expenditure and capital investment for agriculture. No sign really of a will to expand it and repurpose it. In particular, no sign of national responses to agroecological degradation other than hot air, of which there's a great deal. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor White, for opening up this extremely rich perspective on the farmers' crisis, for enabling us to see it as a concatenation, as you mentioned, or a sedimentation of policies and institutions, of history and conjuncture, in other words. Being a labor historian, what I focused on was the fact that agricultural laborers were missing from the farmers' protest, and that's because while we're cheering for the farmers, because they're being oppressed by the state, we sometimes forget that there are other structures of oppression, other hierarchies of oppression, and the agricultural laborers represent that. You talked about the intrusion of corporate capital and the hand of the global grain oligopoly, as you put it. So I think this talk very beautifully merged these different levels, as I promised at the outset, of the global and the local. So you showed the hand of international finance in the crises that we are facing here in Pakistan as well. It seems to be impending because of some inevitable but unfortunate glitches in the IT thing. We lost some time, so we only have time for a couple of questions, I think. Okay, at the back we have a question.
This is Mohammad Haris Muslim from Punjab University, madam. My question is that when we see the agriculture sector, one aspect which we see in Pakistan is the case of sludge in the agriculture. When the time frame of the policy implication regarding agriculture, especially for loans which are given to the people and the farmers. Furthermore, the seeds which are provided by various seed research institutes in Pakistan, there is one in my region near Khanewal, takes a lot of time for the farmers to reach the farmers. I mean, the government used institutions like seed research institutes take a lot of time, and there's a lot of sludge for them to have send the seeds or the better quality pesticides to the farmers. What policy recommendations would you have to reduce such sludge in the Pakistan? Thank you.
May I answer?
Should we take questions from the audience?
Okay,
we'll take a couple more questions and then...
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
Ma'am, my question is that in Pakistan agriculture sector, basically it have a worst effect from the production-based economies. Now, if we are looking towards the knowledge-based economies paradigm shift in the developing countries. So my question is that how can we cope like Pakistan, develop like economies in Pakistan with such time a paradigm shift first from the production-based economies and now the knowledge-based economies, Pakistan and the market are entering into knowledge-based economy. How can we cope with such type of situation and how can we reduce the effect on agriculture? Thank you, ma'am.
Any more questions from the audience? Okay, there's one more question up front.
I have mic.
You have a mic?
Yes.
Okay. Somebody at the back also? First here, then you at the back. First, Sarah, you go ahead.
Hello, Professor Barbara. This is Sarah from IBA. Thank you so much for speaking at our conference. This was a very detailed presentation. You have explained the crisis and made it very easier for us to understand. My question is about why exactly are we not able to address this issue of low agriculture productivity? I mean, since 1947, if you look at the people who are in the parliament, they're either agriculturists or they are industrialists. But at the same time, I mean, these are the people who are making policies. And if agriculture incomes, if it increases, it actually benefits them as well. So the paradox is that despite them being the people who it would benefit the most, still we are not able to address it. Is it the problem of competence? Because if we can talk about crony capitalism, but that can only happen if people don't have personal interest. People over here have personal interest, so how would that be explained? Thank you.
There's one more question at the back, and then we'll. Yeah,
Hello,
start.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. My question is that thank you for the detailed presentation. The environmental issues are increasing in Pakistan daily and on daily basis. My question is, what policies would you recommend to reduce the land erosion that is increasing, especially in Sindh, due to the human-made river directions, and they are not related and they are impacting the environmental issues? I would like to get the answer of this. Thank you.
Okay, Professor White, you can respond now. There are many more questions, but we don't have time. So if you could please respond to these.
Thank you all very much for a series of questions to which I can't respond well because Pakistan is not my field. But the questions are really important questions, and I encourage you to try to find answers for yourself. A general reaction I have is that you're asking me about policies. And my response to that is that as development scholars, we can suggest policies, but we need to know a great deal more than just policy labels to advocate for them in practice. Because policies are discursive, they're legal, they involve resources, financial resources, skilled people, and they need a legal framework within which people can get access to them. And unless all that's in place, policies don't work. So I have just learned last week that FAO has collected 16,000 food policies, but they've collected labels of policies. And without much detail, I really don't think that's a useful database. The first question asked me about sludge, and you were using it figuratively as grit in the wheels to ask about how you improve the efficiency with which inputs to agriculture are supplied. I don't know the answer to that question. Aniketaga in Ashoka is working on that over the frontier. And the answer may well be in the informal economy rather than in state institutions, which often find ways of bypassing log jams in the formal system. But your use of the word sludge reminds me that there's an awful lot about agriculture that the state doesn't record. And sludge is one, which is literally polluted effluent. Agricultural residues which feed the livestock economy is another. I don't know about Pakistan, but there's just no data. It's as though that economy didn't exist. We know nothing about it. So I had a reaction which was not to do with the intent of the question, but the word that you used, that we have to look at agriculture as a system. And we have to look at the unregistered part of and the unrecorded part of the system to understand why it is that the formal system might be slow in its supply of inputs. Then there was a question about how to transform the economy from a production base to a knowledge base. And again, I can only answer it in relation to the literature in India, but there's a big literature from business studies about digital agriculture, about the use of satellite data, about high-tech AI in agriculture. And then there's another kind of literature which says that if we went down the route of agroecology, then that would require a lot of skills which even students with agriculture degrees don't have. So there are all kinds of possibilities of different kind of knowledge entering agriculture, all a bit utopian right now. Sarah asked a question about why the elite, whose wealth is grounded in agriculture, doesn't pioneer a decent set of agricultural policies in Pakistan. But if you have thousands of acres, it doesn't really matter to you whether you have higher or lower yields with scale than smaller farmers. And the Indian literature is a bit confused. There are people who say small farmers are more productive than large farmers, and others who find a direct relationship between farm size and productivity. But suppose there is an inverse law, and your large farmers who are part of your political elite have low yields, relatively speaking, on their holdings. It doesn't bother them because the absolute production of their holdings is so huge, and because their portfolios are no longer in land. So they will capture those bits of the state which they can, but they are not on the side of the mass of farmers, as you rightly said. And the other thing I wanted to say in answer to your question, if there's time, is that in India, and I don't know about Pakistan, the Green Revolution was a very, very strange event because it was a coming together of all different kinds and scales of capital, of the state, corporations, research institutes, banks, of big industry, Parry, Shaw Wallace, fertilizers, pesticides, of small, local moneylenders and dealers. They all came together in the space of 10 years and enabled this transformation of production to happen. And if we're looking to the future, we have to look at that bundle of institutions and wonder whether it will actually all pull in the same direction in the future. The environmental question was about erosion in Sindh. All I know is that in the future, academic research on agrarian society is going to have to extend and encompass research on environment. That whereas now we look at social relations of production, papers really shouldn't be published unless they also look at water, temperature, soil, and how these factors of production are managed. We've been able to separate social science from environmental science, and we're now paying a penalty for it, and progressive scholars must do something about it. Okay, I will leave it there. I'm sure it's overdue. But thank you very much for the questions.
All right, thank you, Professor White. We're running over time, so we'll have to end it here. Unfortunately, it was a privilege listening to you, and I'm sure the audience have more questions, but alas, we're out of time. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.